I'm going to be explaining the key terms of a real estate contract to make sure that you understand exactly what are the most important parts of a contract in layman's terms. So there are contingencies, closing costs, as well as earnest money that we're going to dive a little bit more and dissect. So contingencies are probably one of the most intricate and important parts of a real estate contract, and it boils down to two contingencies that we're going to talk about today. That's the financing contingency and the inspection contingency. Now, the financing contingency only applies if you're financing a purchase or if a buyer's financing a purchase. Otherwise, this is not going to be applicable to your transaction. With the financing contingency, typically in a real estate contract, there will be a certain amount of time in which a buyer can apply for financing and actually cancel a contract in the event that they don't obtain financing. There are certain deadlines, there are certain timelines, and there's certain notices that a buyer has to give to the seller in the event that they're not able to get approved for a loan. It is so important to understand the exact timeframes and what type of notice is necessary in order to cancel a contract. But what this contingency does, allows a buyer to cancel the contract and receive their earnest money deposit back. An inspection contingency is also for the protection and for a buyer who's purchasing a property. What this inspection contingency does is it allows a buyer to go into the property and to inspect the property, to hire an inspector, to understand exactly what are the issues that the property faces, and to have a good understanding what repairs and what maintenance might be forthcoming. A lot of times during this inspection contingencies, buyers will cancel and terminate the contract. And with the as-is contract, what this does is it entitles the buyer to receive their earnest money deposit back, just like the financing contingency. So we're talking a lot about earnest money deposit. What is an earnest money deposit? An earnest money deposit is typically paid to a title company and law firm by a buyer a few days or on the day that a contract's signed. This is the deposit that a buyer's putting down to purchase the property and saying, hey, I'm serious, I want to purchase this property, here's $1,000, here's $10,000, here's $100,000, and gives it to the title company to hold on to. Now, those contingencies allow that earnest money deposit to be returned in the buyer if the buyer actually terminates the contract in the way the contingencies say that they need to. But if they don't, or if a buyer backs out of a deal when they're not allowed to, when they're not permitted to, against what the contract says, well, then that earnest money deposit is essentially the seller's security, and the seller would be entitled to for the buyer doing something that they're not supposed to, like terminating the contract when they're not within their legal rights to do so. The last aspect is closing cost. A real estate contract is typically going to define out the closing cost of what the buyer pays and what the seller pays. Now, all throughout the state of Florida, real estate closing costs are different. So in Indian River County and St. Lucie County, it's more common for the seller to pay title insurance than it is for the buyer. Down in Miami, it's different. The buyer typically pays title insurance. So you want to look, depending upon where the property is located, who's paying these closing costs, and you might want to factor in your offer in the amount that you're offering to purchase depending upon the closing cost. The most important thing you can do as a buyer is to ask your closing agent and to ask the title company for a closing cost estimate before you sign the offer to make sure you understand exactly what closing costs you can expect. You also should ask your lender, what closing costs can I expect? What are your loan fees? What are your origination fees? What are the fees that I should expect to pay at closing for you being my lender? And you want to have those in writing so you can understand exactly what costs are going into your home purchase. Now, each contract's different, and your contract could be different from someone else's contract. So you want to look specifically at your contract, but this provides a very broad and general understanding of these different key contract terms to help you as a buyer or seller have more knowledge going into this closing process. If you have any additional questions, I'm here to help and answer your questions to make sure you feel comfortable with your closing process.